In the waning warmth of summer 1904, beneath the blood-orange haze that often cloaked the horizon of Black Hollow, Massachusetts, a town already half swallowed by the woods and forgotten by the world, a group of 13 peculiar individuals gathered not for prayer or protest, but for something far stranger. They came to awaken the dirt itself. The townsfolk, those few who remained and dared to speak, had long called the stretch of land on the northern hill the Split Earth, not for any seismic history, but because horses refused to step near it, compasses spun in tight frenzy upon it, and dreams turned feral for anyone who slept within hearing distance of its wind. It was there, in the collapsed carcass of an old seminary long since abandoned after a roof collapse during a storm in 1871, that this group, self-proclaimed spiritualists, renegade scholars, and itinerant choir singers, chose to form what would later be called the Chanting Circle. At the helm of this curious group stood Alaric Voss, a spectral man with graying temples, amber eyes that rarely blinked, and a voice like oiled parchment dragged slowly across wet stone. Voss was no ordinary scholar. Born in Danzig and educated in theology, he had become a pariah in Europe after publicly claiming that beneath every major civilization, buried beneath strata of forgotten architecture, there existed not merely ruins, but something older, something alive. He came to America under the guise of studying earth resonances left by pre-colonial peoples, claiming he wished to explore how certain frequencies could evoke spiritual states. But privately, as his notes later suggested, he believed he had decoded part of a map not of geography, but of resonance, a tonal geography where sound could open doors that no key ever had. The others, Ephraim Klen, an alcoholic organist expelled from St. Augustine's Cathedral, Miriam Cross, and a war widow who claimed to have heard her dead husband call from her garden soil, Lydia Finch, a 17-year-old prodigy whose falsetto could make glass shudder, the twin brothers Elias and Thomas Gray, both mute but known to harmonize flawlessly with no conductor. Each brought with them not only voices, but wounds, private obsessions, and a kind of psychic hunger that Voss seemed to smell the way dogs smell fear. They met first on a Friday evening under a swollen moon, the broken frame of the seminary looming like a crooked jawline against the sky, ivy-covered and partially buried in overgrowth. Voss stood in the center of what had once been the sanctuary and unwrapped a scroll, not made of paper or vellum, but a brittle, fibrous skin that no one dared ask the origin of. Upon it, scrawled in a blend of Sumerian cuneiform and early Latin, was a hymn, a chant with no melody, no rhythm, and no comprehensible lyric. Yet when read aloud, seemed to cause the air to thicken and shimmer as if the atmosphere itself were listening. They called it Cantus Primordialis, though Voss admitted no one had named it. It simply named itself when sung. The first rehearsal was a cacophony. Voices strained, lungs faltered, tones collided, but something beneath the noise vibrated, a tremor not of sound, but of perception. Miriam swore her late husband's face appeared briefly in the warped glass of a broken window. Ephraim vomited mid-rehearsal and claimed he'd seen a worm with a human face crawling behind the altar. Voss, meanwhile, grinned through the dissonance, urging them onward, declaring that the wrong notes were the correct ones, that the disharmony was the language itself. By the fourth rehearsal, something had shifted. The acoustics of the ruined chapel began to change. Their chant, once discordant, began to shape the space. Walls vibrated, not just audibly, but visibly. Dust and seed. Hoot leapt in patterns that mimicked crop circles. The wind outside stilled completely during sessions, and birds, once prevalent, ceased to be seen or heard. On the sixth night, the stones on the floor grew warm, and Elias Gray collapsed during the final note, his eyes rolled back, mouth foaming, and yet he kept singing for 22 seconds after unconsciousness claimed him, voice pure and unwavering. The others were frightened, but Voss declared it a sacred sign. He was touched, he said. The soil spoke through him. He did not explain what that meant. That evening they noticed their own reflections looked slightly delayed. Mirrors they passed showed their gestures just a fraction behind real time. No one questioned it aloud. Something had begun to bend, and they were already too deep to retreat. On the seventh night, as a storm passed miles away but never neared the chapel, Voss introduced the true ritual. He placed 13 stones in a perfect circle, each etched with markings that glowed faintly under the lantern light. Symbols none recognized, but all felt they should. Each member stood at their designated stone, mouths dry, hearts sinking not to their own blood, but to the rhythm of some pulse that rose from below. The chant began again, lower this time, deeper, and the ground responded. Not a tremor, not a quake, but a pulsing like breath in reverse, like the earth was inhaling them. The air grew thick with something metallic, and shadows along the wall twisted the wrong direction, not fleeing the light, but crawling toward it. Miriam cried out mid-note, not from pain, but from what she claimed was clarity. She saw something behind her eyelids, a cathedral made of bones and veins, floating upside down in an ocean of black teeth. No one questioned her. Lydia Finch, whose voice carried the melody line, lifted her hands as if in a trance and began to levitate, no more than an inch, but undeniably suspended. When she dropped, the chant broke momentarily, and the walls moaned. Afterward, they sat in silence, each shaken, each altered. Ephraim's fingers twitched uncontrollably. Thomas Gray refused to blink. Lydia smiled at nothing and kept mouthing words no one could hear. Voss stood among them, sweatless, smiling like a priest at Mass. He spoke gently, but with menace. We are near the mouth now. It hears us. We must sing louder, longer, with no fear. That night none of them slept. Some because they couldn't, others because they no longer needed to. Outside, the townspeople noticed the trees near the northern hill began to lean, not due to wind, but as if bowing toward the seminary ruins. Livestock refused to graze nearby. Dogs howled at the grass, not the moon. And in their homes, a few claimed they heard music with no source. Notes like crying whales beneath a river, always ending with a breathless whisper. Keep singing. What none of them knew, or perhaps knew too late to admit, was that the chant wasn't merely awakening something below, it was feeding it. Each note, each breath, each syncopated pause was not just sound, but offering. The cantus primordialis had no end, only descent. A spiral, not of melody, but of soul. The more they sang, the more the choir felt the song singing them. Language broke down in the journal entries recovered decades later. Sentences began normal, but ended in script not known to man. Some entries bled through pages, literally. Letters formed in what was later tested to be human plasma. One final note, attributed to Voss, scrawled across the inside of a lantern's glass. Beneath the soil is not death, but memory. It remembers before God, and it does not forgive silence. The week would close with an eclipse, and Voss promised they would perform the chant in full for the first time, from first breath to final resonance. The townsfolk, unaware of that scope of what was unraveling, would hear only echoes, and a strange hum that made their teeth ache and children scream in their sleep. The true consequences, however, would begin the moment they hit the final note, when the choir crossed a threshold from which there would be no returning, when the shadows would no longer wait in corners but begin to sing back, slowly, hungrily, one by one. But that was still to come. For now they stood amid the ruin, unknowing, chanting to dirt that breathed, to roots that listened, and to something vast and grinning beneath them that had waited far too long to be named. They said Lydia Finch was always the last to leave, even before the chanting began, even before Alaric Voss taught them how to sing in a way that made mirrors sweat and trees lean in closer. Even as a child in Black Hollow, she'd linger at the river bank after the others had gone, humming to the reflections of clouds in the water like she could seduce the sky. Barely 17, and already bearing the kind of voice that made birds forget their songs and old women weep without knowing why, Lydia had joined the Chanting Circle not out of belief, but hunger. Hunger for something deeper than God and older than guilt. On the night of the first full chant, timed deliberately with the lunar eclipse of late August 1904, Lydia stood in her place on the northernmost stone of the circle, her pale dress fluttering like moth wings in the hot, windless air, her eyes half-lidded, not from sleep but from rapture. The group had rehearsed for weeks, and though the chant had no true melody, no rhythm in the traditional sense, it had carved a groove into their throats, a pattern of breath and tension and release that moved through them like a parasite, trying to make them into one body. That night, as the red moon blinked into shadow and the wind outside the chapel died completely, the 13 began their chant. 13 voices stretching syllables that had no meaning but caused the stone beneath their feet to pulse as if it, had lungs. For nearly an hour, the air inside the ruins thickened like steam from boiling blood, their voices overlapping in ways that formed impossible harmonics, low grumbles of root and sky, high keens that scratched the bone of the ear. Time wavered. Shadows slowed. Some later claimed the moon appeared to shiver mid-eclipse, as if the sky had hiccuped. And when the chant ended, abruptly, like a breath held too long, they each opened their eyes and realized something had left with their voices, something they'd given away unknowingly. One by one the members departed the circle, exhausted, sweat-drenched, eyes twitching with after-images that made every lantern flicker seem like a lurking figure. All but Lydia. She lingered, her eyes closed, arms at her sides, head tilted as if still listening for an echo. "Lydia," Miriam Cross called gently, stepping just past her stone. But Lydia raised a hand, just one, and began humming. A soft, quivering tone that didn't match any part of the chant they'd rehearsed, but sounded like a reply from below the floorboards. The others stopped. No one said anything, paralyzed by the eerie sweetness of the melody, as if Lydia's voice had split into octaves not meant for human throats. Then, slowly, the hum faded, like a string being pulled deeper into soil. She opened her eyes once, pupils vast, dilated to eclipse, and smiled, a subtle, tragic smile that looked both grateful and doomed. Then she turned toward the altar stone in the center, placed her hand on it, and whispered something no one could hear, but all would remember feeling, a phrase that made the wooden beams creak, and the silence afterward feel sharpened, like the edge of a scream just before it leaves the lungs. She walked toward the fog then, not looking back, her dress blending with the mist, and though several called her name, none followed. When the morning came and Lydia did not return, concern curdled into something darker. Miriam went to Lydia's home first, finding the girl's bed untouched, shoes still at the door, a small mirror on the nightstand fogged over despite no heat in the room. Her teacup was still warm. It was as though she'd only just stepped out, but hadn't taken her body with her. Thomas and Elias, the mute twins, scoured the trail leading from the seminary ruins to the Finch residence, but found no tracks, no impressions in the grass or mud. Only near the stone where Lydia had stood there remained a faint trail of black dust, like powdered charcoal, that led in a tight spiral to the center of the altar and ended at a shallow depression in the ground no wider than a handprint. Ephraim Clenn, still hung over from whatever foul spirit he'd poured into his flask after the ritual, stumbled upon the scene and muttered that the spiral reminded him of something he'd seen carved into a crypt wall in Prague, something they used to draw to bind silence inside tombs. No one responded. Miriam dropped to her knees, clawed at the spiral, but the dust would not smear or shift. It clung to the stone like dried blood. Voss, always the last to arrive and first to deny fear, surveyed the scene with the same calm curiosity he might have brought to a rare fossil. "She isn't gone?" he said finally, his voice flat but intent. "Not in the way you mean." When Miriam demanded to know what he meant, he simply pointed toward the earth. "She's listening now. She's part of the resonance." The others recoiled at his words, some visibly, some just internally, like flinching without muscles. But no one left. No one walked away from that stone circle or returned to town to tell the sheriff or call for a search. Because even as terror gripped their throats, another emotion had taken root. Curiosity, sick and aching, but powerful. That night, each one of them admitted privately that they had heard Lydia's voice after she vanished. Faint, distant, but unmistakably hers, singing from within the walls of the chapel, or under the floor, or behind their eyelids when they tried to sleep. It came in fragments, sometimes a single note, sometimes a drawn breath, but it was there. She was still singing. Some called it madness. Ephraim began scratching tally marks into his arm with a tuning fork. Miriam stopped speaking aloud and only communicated by mouthing lyrics to the hymn. Even the mute twins began humming in their sleep. Mouths closed, the sound emanating from their throats like ventriloquized echoes. Yet no one left the group. Voss said the silence was a chrysalis, that Lydia was undergoing a transformation. "What you see as absence," he said, standing once again in the circle 3 nights later, "is the first echo of emergence." His eyes were sunken now, yellowing but sharp with conviction. She is not lost. She is heard, beneath. That word, beneath, became a poison and a promise. The word began showing up in their journals, in dreams, scratched into the backs of their chairs at home, burned into toast. One of the twins found it carved into the inside of his own palm, though he had no memory of making the mark. They began to understand that the chant had opened something. Not a door, but an aperture in perception, an invitation downward. The second chant was held 5 days after Lydia's disappearance. The group stood 1 stone short now. Her place remained empty, but the air around it trembled more than the others, as if her absence had made space for something else. When the hymn began, they each felt the sound not enter their ears but rise through their feet, as if it were being sung from underneath them. The stones pulsed. The air snapped. Miriam convulsed and screamed mid-chant, her mouth still moving but now speaking in reverse. Voss raised both hands and continued, never breaking the rhythm. By the end, the soil beneath their feet had hardened, not like rock, but like frozen flesh. When they opened their eyes, the spiral where Lydia had vanished had grown, now reaching the edges of her stone and curling inward. No one dared speak, but when they turned to leave, they each heard a single note ring out, one that none of them had sung. A soprano's hum, gentle, prolonged, coming from the center of the altar. Miriam collapsed into sobs. Ephraim ran until dawn. Voss simply knelt and whispered, "She's learning the words." They didn't realize until a week later that Lydia was not the only one fading. Each member of the circle had begun losing pieces of themselves, not physically, but psychologically, spiritually. Miriam forgot her brother's name. Elias began coughing up dirt every morning. Ephraim couldn't play the organ anymore. Every note he struck came out flat and warbled it like it was being strangled by unseen hands. Thomas began sketching things in soot on his walls. Massive underground mouths lined with bone pipes, and hands reaching upward toward figures with no faces. Still, no one left the circle, because they feared that leaving might make them vanish faster. They clung to the chant like it was a life raft, but in truth, it was an anchor. Then, in the second week after Lydia's disappearance, during a stormless night when the trees stood dead still and even the insects had stopped chittering, the group entered the chapel to find Lydia's dress hanging from the center altar stone, intact, unstained, and warm to the touch. Beneath it, on the floor where the spiral now widened into the shape of an eye, was a small indentation, as though something had pressed upward from the other side. Voss fell to his knees and kissed the stone. Miriam screamed and struck the wall until her knuckles bled. Ephraim finally spoke the words all of them had tried not to think. She didn't disappear. She was taken. But by what? Voss answered that question without speaking. That night he brought with him a scroll none of them had seen before, a second verse, he claimed. Found buried in the wall of the seminary itself, behold, and a false panel. The scroll was damp, smelled of iron and soil, and trembled slightly in his hands. "We must keep singing," he said. "Only by singing will we learn what she was shown." He distributed the markings, which none of them could read, but all could somehow pronounce, and they began to chant again. The stones now throbbed like muscles, and as they sang, the spiral on the floor widened further. The soil around the chapel began to blacken. The trees just outside wept sap so dark it looked like oil. The first silence had been Lydia's gift, or curse, or warning, and though her body was never found, her voice never truly left. It remained in the ground, in the walls, in the minds of the others, always humming, always beckoning. A note without end, a presence without shape. And as the chant deepened, as the circle shrank, and as the names began to vanish one by one, none of them realized that silence was not the absence of sound, but the devouring of self. By the third week, the chant had gone from a ritual to a sickness, and the members of the choir of shadows, those few who still remained in body, had begun to understand that what they once believed was sacred communion was, instead, a feeding, a siphoning, an unseen mechanism turning beneath their feet and grinding their voices into sacrifice, because by now 6 had vanished in the same exact pattern, clockwise from where Lydia Finch had once stood, as if some silent, meticulous hand were moving around the circle and plucking them like rotten fruit from a vine of sound. No matter how erratic the weather or how wary the survivors had become, no matter how desperately they clung to candles or salt or the ragged pages of hymns rewritten in blood and bile, the sequence never deviated. After Lydia, it was Horace Bell, the aging baritone who began coughing up teeth before he disappeared without so much as a coat. Then Est, her Vaughn, the mezzo who'd grown 6 extra molars in a single night and sang them loose with a smile the next morning. Then Jasper Alden, who carved the spiral symbol into every floorboard of his home before evaporating mid-step in front of his horrified mother. Then the mute twins' cousin Rena, who tried to speak for the first time in 10 years and swallowed her own tongue mid-chant. Then Ephraim Clenne, who everyone expected would die drunk or burning, but instead went missing after being seen dancing in the woods, eyes rolled back, singing a harmony so complex it made dogs scream. After each disappearance, the rest would find a tree somewhere deep in the surrounding woods with the missing member's name gouged into the bark. Not in English or Latin or any known tongue, but in pulsating glyphs that resembled an unkempt cuneiform twisted into spirals that bent the eye if stared at too long. Sometimes the glyphs pulsed with faint green light at night, and sometimes they seemed wet to the touch, like the trees themselves wept black sap around the wounds. And Miriam, who had once been the strongest of them, began wearing gloves just to keep from tearing at her own skin after touching one of the symbols and hearing the voice of her long-dead mother whispering nursery rhymes backwards in her ears for 3 nights straight. Alaric Voss, once merely strange, had become terrifying in his serenity. Where the others shook, he smiled. Where they slept, he wandered. Where they feared the spiral, he embraced it, drawing it over and over onto his chest with ash and oil before every ritual, his ribs now faintly visible beneath the faded ink as if he were slowly being hollowed out from within. His voice had changed too, not just in tone, but in origin. His chant no longer came from his throat, but from somewhere behind it, a low, gurgling resonance that made the hairs on the others' necks stiffen and their gums ache with each note. and he began referring to the vanished not as lost or taken, but as molted, like snakes who had shed their useless bodies and now sang from the other side of the soil, deeper, freer, and more fully themselves. His eyes, once sharp and calculating, had sunk into shadowed sockets, yellowed and always leaking a clear, sticky fluid that he refused to wipe. And though he slept less and ate nothing, he grew stronger, taller even, his shadow longer than it should have been in every room, reaching toward the spiral altar like a hungry limb. The others, those few who still clung to their names, began to fear him more than the forest, more than the chant, more than the symbols. But none dared leave, because the spiral had worked its way into their minds, curling tight and tight and tighter, until thought itself was shaped like it, until they woke from dreams they couldn't remember, humming melodies they'd never learned, until their reflections began to mouth words out of sync, smiling when they weren't, weeping when they were numb. Black Hollow itself began to rot from the edges inward. Animals fled the valley entirely. Birds vanished from the sky. Insects died in clusters around the circle's perimeter, and even the trees began to warp. Not from drought or blight, but from something deeper, something tonal, as if the frequency of the land had shifted, making the wood fibers scream so high only dogs could hear it, until even the dogs refused to come near. The wind, once sharp and unpredictable, now only moved in a steady inhale, a low, sucking breath that moved in waves from the altar outward, making the grass bend in concentric rings like ripples from a voice that had no mouth. And the few remaining villagers who hadn't yet abandoned Black Hollow entirely spoke in hushed tones of the music underfoot, claiming they could feel vibrations in their floorboards at night, or hear soft humming when they placed their ears to the dirt near the forest edge, or that their children had begun sleepwalking toward the hill, eyes wide open and mouths stitched shut by invisible threads. By the time only 4 members remained, Alaric, Miriam, and the twins Elias and Thomas, the Chanting Circle had transformed from a group into a haunting and echo chamber, a ritual no longer performed out of belief, but out of necessity, like breathing or bleeding or burying the dead, and even though they had not sung since Ephraim's disappearance, the altar stone hummed constantly now, day and night, a low sub-frequency that made their bones rattle and their eyes water, and in its presence, time no longer moved forward in proper sequence. Miriam once walked to the chapel at dusk and arrived before noon, swearing she saw her own footprints walking ahead of her, and the twins, who shared dreams even before the chant, now dreamed only in symbols, pulsing white marks that arranged themselves into names and then unraveled into worms made of syllables, coiling endlessly in a spiral that reached down, down, down into what they only called the beneath. They had tried once, just once, to destroy the circle. Miriam, desperate and half-mad with grief, had stolen kerosene from the blacksmith's barn and poured it over the altar, muttering psalms through broken teeth, but the flame refused to take. She struck match after match, screamed scripture into the sky, but the liquid simply boiled off the stone like holy water thrown at a demon, and the wood beneath the altar did not blacken or burn, but wept. Actual tears, thick and amber and reeking of something that made her vomit blood for 2 days. Alaric did not scold her. He only approached slowly, knelt beside her in the mud, and whispered, "It doesn't want fire. It wants voice. Yours." She struck him then, hard, full palm across the face, but his skin gave too easily, like fruit bruised to softness, and he smiled through the blow, lips parting slightly to reveal that his teeth had changed, sharper now, uneven, as if new ones were growing. But the blade broke against her sternum, and where it snapped, a glyph was revealed beneath her skin, pulsing. Alive. She did not speak again. It was Elias who was found first, or rather what remained of him, curled like an aborted child in the rotting bell tower of St. Semra's church, naked and half covered in soil that smelled of copper and decay, his mouth wide open in a silent scream that became song the moment someone drew near. And though he'd only vanished a week earlier, his body now looked like it had aged 4 decades. Hair white, spine warped like something had been growing inside him and then decided to leave violently, nails hardened into talons, teeth elongated unevenly as if they'd been pulled and reinserted by a blind child with a thirst for symmetry. No one could say how he climbed the bell tower. There were no footprints, no broken rungs, no disturbed dust. Only the lingering echo of a humming sound that had driven the vicar blind and sent 3 altar boys vomiting into the garden for reasons they could not explain, and when the town doctor tried to examine Elias, the boy began to sing, not words but tones, low, ancient, layered, and the doctor collapsed from a cerebral hemorrhage before he even touched the stethoscope. They tried to sedate him, but no drug entered his veins. The needles bent or broke or turned to rust the moment they pierced the skin, and after a single night in the infirmary, Elias vanished again, leaving behind only a spiral drawn in bile on the floor and a choir of crickets that had not existed in Black Hollow for over 100 years, chirping in unison around his empty bed. The town was breaking now, splintering at the edges, like an egg beginning to hatch from the inside out. People forgot names, not just of others, but of themselves. Mirrors cracked without impact, as if rejecting what they were asked to reflect. Animals birthed dead. Clocks ticked backward, and windows shuddered in their frames without being touched. The journal was found much later, buried beneath the altar in a cavity that should not have existed, wrapped in a flesh-like cloth, bound in a cover made of hardened sinew and teeth, sealed with wax molded into the shape of a human tongue, its pages stitched together with human hair and written in 2 hands, the first half in Alaric's spidery, meticulous script, and the second in something that looked less written than grown, symbols that writhed faintly if stared at too long, impossible to translate directly, but clearly constructed from the phonetic skeleton of the original chant. The final intelligible entry, dated September 23, 1904, read simply, "We have summoned it. It remembers our voices. It eats not flesh, but names. And once it sings back, we will never silence it." The day after that entry, the town of Black Hollow ceased to exist in any official capacity. No one knows exactly what happened, but by October 1st, the government had declared the area uninhabitable due to infection and sent in 2 teams of surveyors, neither of which returned. A 3rd team arrived by rail and found no structures intact, only foundations overgrown with black moss, trees twisted into unnatural spirals, and a thick fog that muffled sound and burned the skin. They reported seeing shapes moving just out of view, and when they attempted to camp, their instruments began to malfunction. The compasses spun violently, their watches melted slightly, and one man was found muttering chants in his sleep, his mouth overflowing with ash. The land was condemned and eventually erased from most maps. Only one rail line leads near it now, and the conductor is trained never to stop, no matter what flags or figures appear on the tracks. But those who've studied the legend, those who whisper about the choir of Shah.